Okay, hi everyone and welcome to our webinar, A Strategic Guide to Windows Servicing. My name is Dave Fuller. I'm the product manager for the 1E Windows Servicing Suite. I've been in IT now for nearly 30 years, I think, focusing mostly on desktop management and automation. I'm joined today by Barry Angell. Barry, do you just want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. So my name's Barry Angell. I work as the CTO at Juriba, and like Dave, I've spent many years in the desktop management space, maybe a little fewer, but around about 20 years in this space.
Excellent, thanks Barry. So before we get started today, I'm just going to run through some housekeeping. As attendees, you may have heard your mics are going to be muted throughout the webinar, but we do want to hear from you. So if you've got any questions, please enter them in the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel that you should see up on the right hand side of your screen. And we'll get to answer those at the end. The session is being recorded. Will be available from our on-demand webinars page on our website within the next couple of days. So if you've got any colleagues that are unable to attend, or if you need to drop off early or anything like that, you can catch up on it tomorrow. The session, we're aiming to about 45-50 minutes of content, so we'll have about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So today we're going to be looking at Windows servicing. We're going to give you an overview of what it's all about and update you on some of the changes over the last few months. We're then going to be looking at how it affects your organization. It's time to start thinking of managing your Windows upgrades as a process rather than a project. And Barry's going to be exploring some different deployment strategies and also identifying some of the skills that are going to be required to support the cultural change to managing Windows going forward. So let's start with the basics. What is Windows servicing all about? Well, since the release of Windows XP in 2001, the newer versions of Windows have generally been getting closer together as they've been released. So there were 6 years between XP and Vista, that one that we all want to forget about, I guess. Windows 7 was then 2 years later in 2009. Windows 8 came out then 3 years later, and then there was a year between Windows 8 and 8.1 and another year between 8.1 and 10 back in 2015. So they have been getting closer together, and most organizations skipped Vista and went straight to Windows 7. So they were probably running Windows XP for at least 8 years and have probably been running Windows 7 for the last 5 years or so. Most organizations, I think, or a lot of them, have skipped 8 and 8.1 and then are either planning now to go to Windows 10 or maybe you've already started. Now, with Windows 10 in 2015, when it was released, Microsoft announced that instead of new Windows versions as we know them, the operating system is going to be updated incrementally 2 to 3 times a year. Now, those increments will be released in the form of feature updates. Now, a feature update is effectively a new version of Windows 10. They're identified by the year and the month of release. So the first of these feature updates was released in 15.11 version that was released in November 2015. So that was the first feature update after the initial release of Windows 10, which was, I suppose, a 15.07 release back in July. And that was followed by 16.07 and 17.03, and just last week, if you hadn't heard, the next the latest release, 17.09, came out. Now we're going to cover the actual cadence of these releases shortly. The feature upgrade itself introduces new features. It's probably closest conceptually to service packs as we knew them in previous versions of Windows. Now, the security and performance improvements are delivered through quality updates. These are monthly updates to each specific version of Windows 10. The key point to remember is that quality updates are published for a limited time for any given version or feature upgrade of Windows 10. And after that time, you're not going to get any more quality updates available for that specific version. So while there's nothing technically stopping you from staying on older versions of Windows 10, in today's environment and climate of cybercrime and keeping things current, you're not going to be able to secure your operating system against new attacks if you're on those old feature updates. So it's this limited period of time, limited availability of security updates that's driving the need to keep up with the feature updates. It's also important to understand that the feature upgrades and quality updates are cumulative. So a device that's missed an update can actually be brought up to date by applying the latest update. But as Barry is going to cover off later, while it is possible to skip a feature update, you're going to actually need to be much more agile in order to catch up before the older version goes out of support if you do skip. So I'd say Barry will be covering that off in a bit more detail later. Now, up until the summer of this year, we talked about branches to describe the options for deploying and managing the Windows 10 feature upgrades. We had current branch, which described Windows 10 feature update at the point that it became generally available to the public. So consumer devices would start to automatically receive these updates once they'd been released to the current branch. And current branch for business described a state where the current branch release, along with any subsequent quality updates, was determined to be kind of enterprise ready. Now, the expectation was that this state would be announced about 4 months after the current branch release, at which point Microsoft republished the same feature update with the latest cumulative quality update applied to it. So you was kind of all up to date with that release. Now, it's important to understand, though, that the current branch and current branch for business weren't different versions of a feature update. There's no difference if you look at the machine or look at the operating system on the machine that was installed using the feature update after it went to current branch for business, so it was deferred, compared to a device that maybe you installed earlier than that using the current branch. As long as the latest quality updates have been applied, those operating systems would look exactly the same. Now, the current branch and current branch for business concept really only applies to when the update would be applied to devices. And it really only made sense if you're using Windows Update to apply updates. If you're using WSUS or Config Manager, you can actually control that a lot more granularly. Initially, clients would be configured to simply defer installation of updates if you wanted to go to the current branch of business, and they would wait for that republished feature update when it was announced as current branch for business. More recently, you had a bit more control. You can configure variable deferral periods through group policy, and that process is what's described as Windows Update for Business. So using group policy to build out more granular deferrals of updates. Now, as I mentioned earlier, for any given feature updates, the quality updates or those monthly patches are only available for a limited period of time. And after that time period, that was actually 23 months for the initial release of Windows 10 and 24 months for 15.11, you had to apply the next feature update in order to stay in support and maintain a secure OS. Now, such a fast-paced life cycle isn't necessarily practical for some of your critical business systems or devices. Think about things like ATMs, point-of-sale devices, and control systems. So the long-term servicing branch provided an alternative with quality support, quality update support there for 10 years, much longer than the current branch ones. Now, while the long-term servicing branch shares a version number with its current branch cousin, so there was a 1607 release, for example, it's actually a different edition of Windows 10 Enterprise. You have to install it from in a different media, and it comes up as a different SKU effectively. Additionally, it doesn't include many of the kind of out-of-the-box apps that the current branch will come with, things like Edge, Cortana, OneNote, and Camera, stuff like that. So that was up until the summer of this year. Now, in July, Microsoft announced some of the updates to the servicing terminology and also the release cadence. Now, current branch and current branch for business are no longer used. Instead, we've got the semi-annual channel that releases feature updates twice a year in spring and in the fall, or autumn if you're a UK person like myself. You may see references to targeted and broad deployment states for the semi-annual channel, which broadly correspond to the current branch and current branch for business. But basically what Microsoft is saying is start piloting when the feature update is first released, and then broaden the deployment to incorporate all of your devices over an 18-month period. And that's what Barry is going to be covering off later on in discussing strategies for managing that kind of deployment. Long-term servicing branch has simply been renamed to long-term servicing channel. So you'll probably see a period of interchange where you'll see both of those. But yeah, there's not really any other change in the release itself. So putting all of this together, what's the reality of the life cycle of Windows 10? So this diagram here maps out the life cycle of Windows 10 over the last 2 years and projecting out over the next 2. We've got the orange dots on the left of each bar indicating the new feature updates, and the white shields each month representing the quality updates. So to start with, we've got the initial release of 1507 in July 2015. This was released to current branch and to long-term servicing branch at that point. And the last quality update for the current branch was published in May 2017. So the full life cycle lasted, as I said before, 23 months. Quality updates are expected to be available for the 1507 long-term servicing branch, shown in the grey bar there underneath, through to 2025. My chart doesn't go on to that far, so they don't actually stop in March 2020. They're expected to continue for 10 years after the initial date. Then we got 1511, released to current branch in November 2015, was published to the current branch for business 5 months later in April 2016. Support for that has just run out actually this month, so the full life cycle for that was actually 24 months from beginning to end. Then we had 1607, released to current branch that was August 2016, current branch for business 4 months later. And that's expected to go end of life in March next year. Nothing conclusive, but that's the expectation. You'll note that there's also another long-term servicing branch released at the same time, and that again, that'll continue to be supported out for the next 10 years. Now, 1703, that was released to current branch in April 2017, and as I said before, it's in July that Microsoft announced the change in terminology to the semi-annual channel. So 1703 is considered the first Windows 10 version to follow the semi-annual channel. The semi-annual channel is going to support any given Windows 10 version for 18 months from it first being released. So we can expect the 1703 version to go end of life in September next year. And then if you're keeping up with all of this, we've got the 1709, which is just released just last week. And you can start to pilot this pretty much as soon as you're ready and accelerate the deployment throughout your environment according to your own circumstances and requirements. But we've got the next deadline looming in March 2019 and the next release of Windows 10 expected in March, April next year. So you can see where the sense of urgency arises. Now, if you're concerned about the time it's going to take to get a new feature update fully deployed, you might be tempted to skip a feature update. For example, I may want to go from 1709 straight to 1809. If I did that, I'd only actually have a 6-month window to fully pilot and deploy 1809 before 1709 went out of support. And Barry's going to be covering off these options later on. Okay, so let's go to our first poll. And our poll today is, what Windows 10 version are you piloting today? So maybe you haven't started piloting Windows 10 and you're ready to embark on that. Maybe you're piloting one of the 1607, 1703, or perhaps you're really on the ball and you're starting with the 1709 that came out last week. Interesting to see these numbers. Okay, just give it a little while longer and the poll will close. We see those results up. Well, look at that. 24% of you already piloting 1709. That's fantastic to see. That's a good almost half there on piloting 1703. And the minority, in fact, that haven't started piloting yet. So that's good. You're on the path, and you're piloting versions. Those on 1607, obviously, you know, those you'll need to be thinking about if you're piloting at this stage. You'll be getting to the end of the life of that relatively soon, so you'll be thinking about the strategies for getting onto the next one, which we'll be covering off later on. Okay. So let's go into the meat of this. What are some of the things that you need to think about when you're planning for this new update cadence? So for your initial migration to Windows 10, you're likely to have to replace a number of devices that just simply won't support Windows 10, depending on how old your hardware is today, especially considering some of the hardware requirements, things like UEFI, TPM, and hardware virtualization that are required to support Windows 10 security features. I do know there's some organizations that have held back on replacing PCs over the last year or two deliberately because they're planning to replace probably half or more of their estate in their migration to Windows 10. So are there any Windows 10 drivers for all the devices that your users are using today as well? That's another consideration with the hardware. Applications are obviously a big concern for most organizations. To your users, they're probably the most important service IT provides. It's what they use to do their work with their kit. But do you know what applications you've actually got out there? Do you have applications that won't run on Windows 10 at all? Do you have vendors? Have you got statements from your current vendors regarding their support for Windows 10? You know, when will they have versions of their products supported, or will they release support statements on those products for each release? What impact is that application remediation going to have on your business if you've got business critical apps that you've got to fix up or maybe replace? And are there additional licensing costs to upgrade or replace any of those current applications? You've got to think about what deployment process you're going to use. Probably for the initial migration to Windows 10, you could use an in-place upgrade. Maybe you'll prefer to take a wipe and load approach and put a clean OS build down to tidy things up. Good opportunity to do that. There are obviously, as we said before, machines that are going to need replacing, so you've got to think about migrating data and applications. The ongoing feature updates after that can be applied and probably will be as just simple in-place upgrades, but you still need to think about having a process within your organization to build out new machines and maybe do break fixes and such like that. So for that, you're going to need to keep your Windows 10 images refreshed as each feature upgrade releases. Bear in mind that you're going to be probably maintaining at least 2 version images for a given period of time, you know, as you're piloting a new release and maybe continuing to build out or break fix builds for existing machines on the previous release. You also need to think about constraints on your deployment infrastructure. If you're using Config Manager, you'll need to get onto its current branch and keep that updated in order to maintain support for Windows 10 feature updates. You'll notice there's a correlation between Config Manager updates and their support for Windows 10. And in fact, Config Manager is now expected to follow the same semi-annual channel as Windows 10, and that also applies to Office 365 going forward. So they all should be in sync going forward from now. Don't forget that Windows servicing is going to involve distribution of a lot of content as well. So think about using peer-to-peer content distribution solutions to minimize the amount of infrastructure you're going to need to maintain. And then finally, there's logistics of actually deploying the OS out to thousands of devices, determining which devices are ready to upgrade, you know, what capacity have you got within your IT and service desk teams. And this is where automation is really going to help in increasing that capacity and allowing you to do more in the time that you've got. How are you going to communicate your plans to your users? So there's a lot to think about there. Barry, how do we get on top of all of this and keep up with all these releases?
Okay, thank you, Dave. Well, I think, the main things are you're going to hear two phrases from Microsoft in the forthcoming months. One is very much get current, stay current. So that's aimed at those companies that are on the path to Windows 10 or maybe just starting their projects to move to Windows 10. The other, for those already migrated, or at least some way through their rollouts, is that it's a process, not a project. And by this, they're referring to the frequent updates to the operating system that organisations like yours must adhere to in order to keep current and secure. Now, in my experience, a process with a deadline is typically what you would call a project, but we'll worry about the terminology later, and we'll still call it a process for now. Now, as Dave explained, the evolution here really is from the big bang migrations of the past to a new world of constant change with Windows 10 as a service. No longer can we wait 4 or 5 years between OS upgrades as we did before. So in this graphic, you'll see the old world on the left-hand side, the blue bars designating the rollout of Windows XP and Windows 7, which are the typical platforms we used, and the height of those bars indicating the time and budget that those particular projects spent and took. Now, you'll also notice the blank spaces, and this is typically where our IT estates suffered from device and application sprawl, meaning that each project, when it came along, had a lot to fix in the environment to get to the latest OS. Now, if you move to the right-hand side, you'll see the new world of constant change, so small incremental changes at a much higher frequency. Now, the big difference here is that Windows 10 feature updates are a lot more intrusive than the old service packs, because the service packs typically comprised of primarily security patches. So that change means that our environments are at a higher risk of disruption with each feature release. So in turn, this means a lot more impact analysis across our estate before we can go ahead and deploy. Okay, so let's look a bit more into the process of updating your devices from Release A to Release B of Windows 10. As you'll see, this isn't just a technical process, which is the common pitfall that quite a few organisations fall into. Now, at Juriba, we typically break this cycle into 5 distinct phases, and you can see these running along the bottom. So the first is to baseline exactly what you have in your environment, who's using what, where, and how. You'll be recreating your core image, as Dave has said earlier, making any settings changes that correspond to the new functionality available in the latest OS. In parallel, you'll be assessing your environment to scope the effort required to process the upgrade. So we need to understand which hardware and applications still work and which are going to need either replacing or remediating. So you'll also need to consider where in the life cycle each of these assets lives. Are they due for refresh anyway, for example, on a piece of hardware? So now that we know what we need to do, each asset must be categorized for both the hardware upgrade path and the application upgrade path. And from here, we can define our deployment rings and start to prioritize any remediation work that might be necessary. Our third stage is to start the readiness tracking. Now, this isn't just about applications and hardware, but also about infrastructure readiness and business readiness. So, for example, as we've mentioned before, you might need to upgrade your config manager infrastructure to support the new release, or maybe you've got a business unit that has its own major application release that necessitates a change freeze. Now, as we get through that phase, our devices are starting to turn green and ready for migration, so we can move into the scheduling and logistics phase. Now, we recommend here that you employ self-service to drive both rationalization efforts and migration volumes, and obviously leverage end-user comms to inform the user base of what's happening to them and when. And then finally, we get into the technical deployment phase. Now, often this will be capacity constrained, either in terms of the network or in terms of physically on the service desk. And of course, products like 1eNomad can help mitigate that network capacity issue. And then once we're through, it's on to the next release and off we go again. So very cyclical. Okay, so let's look at deployment strategies. Now in this slide, I've blown up Dave's earlier timeline so that we can focus on the here and now, starting with release 1607, and this ties quite nicely to the poll. So what I'd like you to do is draw your eyes down to the 1709 line, which is the release that came out last week. Now you can see within this line how the new methodology translates. So the orange section to begin with is your initial assessment, and then typically you'll pilot with the IT group and then some selected business users. And then once through those two phases, you'll be out into your broad deployment rings. Now there's many ways to decide your feature update rollout strategy, but they typically fit into four main categories that we have listed at the top of this page. So firstly, you can stick with the long-term servicing branch or servicing channel. But as Dave mentioned earlier, this isn't really designed for your average enterprise desktop, but it's still a strategy to consider if you really don't care about any new OS feature updates in the next 5 or 10 years. Now, if we ignore that one as a common platform, you're really left with three typical options. So the first of these is that you would deploy every new feature update to every asset, and this gives you a perpetual 6-month rollout cycle. Now the next option would be to deploy to skip every second release, sorry. So if you were rolling out 1703 now, your next upgrade would be to 1803. And this is very much a strategy that Microsoft supports because all of the updates are cumulative. And then finally, you might decide to break up your estate and support 2 simultaneous versions. So if you had, for example, 30,000 seats, you might run 15,000 of them on 1703, 15,000 on 1709, and then skip a release accordingly for each of those 2 subsets. So what's all the fuss about? Well, let's look closely in this diagram at September 2018. Now, in this instance, what you can see highlighted is that we are actually supporting 5, and maybe if we had an earlier long-term service branch, even 6 different Windows 10 releases simultaneously. So you're finishing your 1703 rollout, you're halfway through your 1709 rollout, just starting your 1803 rollout, and just gone into evaluation on 1809. So that's including also any long-term service branches that you're also supporting. So if you think about this from an application perspective, if you're planning a new application into the environment, you may have to test against all 6 of those platforms. So it can get very complicated because of the speed of change we're managing. Now, it's understandable to think that skipping a release might make things a lot easier. After all, it's one less release to manage, and that sounds like quite an attractive proposition. But like most things that sound great, there's consequences to it. So let's imagine that we're rolling out 1703 and we've decided to skip last week's 1709 release. Now, the key thing on this slide is the 1703 end of life date. So if you look at the 1703 bar, move to the right, you can see that this is due to go end of life around about September 2018. Now 1803 is only released in March, or if we look at 1703, actually came out in April. So maybe April 2018 is a good target for the 1803 release. Now what this actually gives you is only 5 or maybe 6 months to deploy your entire estate from its current 1703 version up to the 1803 version before that 1703 version goes out of security support and puts you potentially at risk. So even on a vastly accelerated timeline, in our example organization, you can see that we're only just into the 2nd broad deployment ring, and that leaves some of our devices out of security support. Now, this means that the big question for all of us to consider is whether we can achieve the required velocity within the existing teams to keep all of your assets within life cycle under this skipping releases methodology. So we'd like to do a second poll question here, and we're interested to find out what deployment strategy you think is most suitable for your organization. So is it to stick with the LTSC, deploying every release, skipping releases, or phasing your assets. So we'll just give that a minute for the results to be collected. Okay, so the results are in. Let's have a look at the results. So yeah, very interesting. So we've got a sort of 50-50 split between the deploying every release and skipping of releases. So that's pretty common with discussions we're having with customers. Certainly the larger ones potentially looking to skip releases. The smaller ones believe they can keep up with the cadence of change. And then we've got the phased releases, which tends to be the huge customers that simply are not going to be able to achieve either the skip in the time frame or deploying to all assets. So that's great. That definitely aligns with a lot of conversations we're having. Okay, so let's talk about deployment rings and why they could be the key to success for your organization. So we should start with some definitions. A deployment ring is simply a logical grouping of your assets. So it could be by business unit, it could be by location, it could be by function, or it could be by a completely different set of criteria. So if we take an example organization of 30,000 devices, we might decide, for example, that we want 3,000 devices to go into a pilot phases. So this would leave 27,000 to deploy over, let's say, 10 broad waves of 2,700 devices. Now, the deployment rings are how we split up between what goes first and what comes last. Now, it sounds simple, but there is some maths to consider here. So let's say we follow this diagram and we put all of our IT department into our pilot phases. Now, this means that you need to ready potentially most of your applications, because typically IT is the heaviest application user in any organization. So your velocity potentially, again, just hit a brick wall because you've created a deployment ring that contains too much work and will then therefore stall the rest of the rollout. Now, in this slide, what you'll see on the left is a typical deployment timeline. So in previous projects, we tend to see very slow ramp-ups, often caused by things like the IT pilot issue I discussed in the previous slide, and high volumes towards the end of the process. Now, this type of timeline on the left simply won't work in the new Windows 10 as a service world, which is why we need to move much more towards the graph on the right. Now, on the graph on the right, we can see the same initial workload to get things ready, but we're accelerating early deployment to accelerate the timeline. Now, the key to this acceleration is to do things differently from how we've done them in the past. So, for example, creating deployment rings based on application spread. So in other words, if I analyze which of my applications turn the most devices green, then I immediately have defined my initial deployment rings, and I'm going to get the quickest velocity into the process. You can layer on further accelerators like self-service validation and scheduling, and the ability to deploy as soon as the asset is ready, irrespective of what ring it's in. But maybe even in that situation, we could look at break-fix scenarios and other scenarios to help drive velocity into that upgrade process. And of course, you can't do this without the right tooling. So if you think that spreadsheets are going to cut it with this level of complexity, then you really have to put some significant effort in now to make those work in a repeatable fashion across multiple simultaneous processes or projects. So we've looked at the technical aspect of this, but there's an even more significant aspect to consider, and that's the cultural change your organization is going to have to go through. Now, in most organizations, our business as usual functions have been quite reactive in nature, leaving the big proactive initiatives to our project teams or our outsourced partners. Now, with Windows 10 as a service, our biggest change is to make these BAU teams become a proactive entity. So they need to think and act like a project team in order to get the rollout coordinated and completed within a set time frame. Now, in turn, this is going to need some potentially new skills into those teams that we've outlined here. And these are skills that maybe don't exist in the current BAU organisations. So firstly, the ability to communicate change and impacts to the business. So why are we having to go through this cycle? What benefit are the business going to receive? Being able to sell that concept of the as a service model and the disruption, but the productivity improvements that we will receive and the security improvements that we'll receive as a result. Also being able to think about the end-to-end process and how to repeat a cycle with set roles and responsibilities. So we're going to repeat this constantly. How do we actually define what that process looks like? Maybe having a more data-driven approach to our work. So understanding how data can be used to set an appropriate work schedule. We need to work backwards from the timeline. How much work do we need to do and what velocity do we need to deploy to meet that timeline? And finally, one which is much more common within our BAU skill set is the ability to understand exactly what the user is going to go through during each upgrade and obviously the risks associated with it. So to end, we really wanted to consider some of the things that you can do now to position yourselves for the as a service model. These are no means all you can do, but we think they're a good starting point. Now, number one is to get culturally ready for it. So making sure everyone in the organisation knows what's about to hit them in terms of the new model impact. Secondly, starting to define your perfect, in quotes, deployment strategy. So it might be a theoretical exercise, but it will help you understand what level of workload is going to be involved. The third item is to think about setting up a function to manage the as a service model. Of course, we're just looking at Windows 10 here, but as Dave mentioned earlier, we're also going to have Office 365 and SCCM happening at the same time, and that's a lot of change to manage, so a dedicated function might be a good idea for most organizations. Next, you can start to make sure you have documented your end-to-end process and workflow for managing the upgrades. So what should happen and when? How are you going to communicate with your end users, manage the application testing, manage scheduling and the like? And then finally, you should really start to consider whether your existing tooling is sufficient to manage this process repeatably. Of course, we'd love you to look at Juriba Dashworks for the planning and readiness control and into the Windows 10 servicing suite from 1E. Both tools would help you better plan, manage and execute the deployments in a much more automated fashion than maybe you're used to in the past. So with that, we'd like to end the presentation, and Dave, I'll hand back to you for wrapping up the session.
Excellent, thanks Barry. Before we get into the questions, I just wanted to highlight some of the further content that we've got both on the Juriba website and the 1E website. So there's the definitive guide to alleviating your Windows 10 servicing headaches. That's as a paper published on Juriba's site that's has got some of the details and charts and things that you saw in this webinar. There's the definitive Windows 10 project plan, which you can download as a PDF or project file. It's a really useful resource. And as Barry mentioned earlier as well, there's a lot of information there on the Juriba Dashworks. I've highlighted there a short video that kind of gives a highlight. And then on the 1E site, we've got a number of blogs there around the Windows servicing. There's the product video summary of the Windows servicing suite, as Barry mentioned there before. Talks about the suite which automates a lot of the processes that we were talking about. And a number of recordings that we've done as previous webinars on Windows 10, just highlighting the fast tracking Windows 10 migration one there. So do take a look at our websites and dig into the resources there, and by all means get in touch if you've got any further questions. So with the questions in mind, one of the things that we have had on this particular webinar has been a number of requests for the slides. So we haven't in the past normally published the slides, but due to the number of requests, I'm sure we can get some of those good juicy slides out there. So that'll be good. So let's have a look at what questions we got. We got a couple in. How are clients that are already configured for current branch for business work now that current branch for business doesn't exist? Yeah. I suppose, well, it's a terminology change as much as anything, but as we kind of covered off in this webinar, it's actually more of a kind of mindset change. So the semi-annual channel that we talked about, it does start with the targeted phase, which really corresponds to current branch. So clients that are getting updates directly from Windows Update that are, if you've currently configured them for current branch for business, then they're going to continue to get those feature upgrades around about 4 months after the general release. You can, I think I mentioned this before, this sort of granularity, you can continue to use group policy to define the more granular deferral periods. And you can build out your deployment rings, which is basically what the Windows Update for Business is all about. But again, that's really only relevant when the devices that you're managing are being, if you're using Windows Update to directly manage those. Now, looking at what we've covered today, rather than thinking about sort of two distinct phases, you know, the what we were thinking about current branch and current branch for business, or targeted and broad, I like to think of it more as a kind of continuum, the semi-annual channel sort of starting from initial release. And you're going to have, as we've seen in this webinar, sort of more your own kind of granular phases, starting with piloting as soon as you can, really, after the feature becomes available. And if you're using tools such as WSUS and Config Manager, you're going to have a lot more control over sort of when that release gets out to the various machines in your environment, based on the rings that Barry was talking about. So yeah, I personally now sort of think of it as a continuum, rather than you know, an 18-month continuum start to finish, rather than a kind of specific phases. And it's really up to you and your capacity to get things done as to whether you when you actually deploy those out to various rings. We got one. When is the next LTSC expected? The long-term servicing channel. Yeah, we did see there was, so as you saw from the chart, there was one, the initial release 1507, and there was another one following the year later. Apparently that was down to the 2016 release was down to changes in Windows Server that needed to be picked up, and there's an amount of shared code between Windows 10 and Windows Server. Now, Michael Niehaus suggested at Ignite that the next LTSC, I should say, I was going to say B there, the next long-term servicing channel release will probably be 2019. So that'll be 3 years after the last one, but that's the sort of cadence we can expect. One for Barry here. We've got, yeah, do we know how many applications typically break between different versions of Windows 10? Any insight on that, Barry?
Yeah, it's a question that I'm sure we'd all like the answer to, and the reality is that right now we don't know that answer. We are still with a slight gap in the market with tools that can give us a definitive version. So what we really need to look at here is obviously the amount of code change that Microsoft is making between releases. Now, what we do know is that the initial releases, the 1507 to 1511 and the 1511 to 1607, made a huge amount of code changes. So the impact of those was a lot higher than it will be for 1607 to 1703 and 1709. The amount of change there has reduced significantly. Now, what Microsoft have been doing is deprecating certain components. So what you'll see is that a lot of the application impact is going to be primarily around things like middleware of .NET frameworks, JREs and that kind of stuff not being supported, as well as potentially different drivers supporting different applications. So like a scanning application may have its drivers again not working because of a Windows 10 update. Now, what's as important as that is the vendor lifecycle. So what we believe we're going to start seeing is a number of vendors tying their application life cycles into the Windows 10 OS cycles in order to force an upgrade and obviously a maintenance and support or new license fee accordingly. So whilst that isn't happening yet, this is the kind of model that we believe that the vendors will have to start supporting in order to keep up with the same cadence of change that we're having to support as enterprises. So whilst unfortunately I can't give a definitive answer to the how many will break, what I will say is that we're working very extensively in the background with a couple of partners to set up a true evaluation so that we can publish some results in the next couple of months, and that should tell us exactly what the impact is between one release and the next release based on a common set of applications that live on those particular devices.
Great, thanks Barry. We've got one here. Does Juriba Dashworks aid in projecting velocity of deployment? How fast can we go? Completion of Windows 10 deployments and comparing different time periods of deployments against others.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's something that certainly over the last few years we've obviously noticed more and more that applications are the key blocker to gaining any velocity, whether it's a Windows 7 to 10 project or a 10 to 10 project. So what we've been doing with our tool set is effectively to work on a couple of elements. Number one is to identify that current state to target state mapping, but then secondly to start using that target state mapping to define the what if model. So for example, if we put these devices into ring 0, how many apps do we now need to get ready, and in what order should we prioritize them? So we now have some modeling within Dashworks that gives us that type of view, and where we find it really useful is actually at the outset of all of these projects. So identifying a priority order based on some mathematical algorithms that effectively say which application, if I look at my entire estate, gets most of my devices closest to a green state, and using that algorithm iteratively across every single application then builds us a priority list that we can then pivot by location and department. So the answer to that is yes, and it's a critical step these days in both defining the art of the possible, because application spread doesn't necessarily translate to a pragmatic rollout timeline, but what it does do is it gives us the ability to say, okay, mathematically this is the fastest way we can go, and if we do these 100 applications first, then we get 50% of our devices green. So absolutely doing that sort of modeling is very much part of what we do at Juriba.
Excellent, thanks. We've got lots of questions here, so we'll be wrapping up in a couple of minutes, but probably got time for one or two more. So if an upgrade to a new release causes application incompatibility, will Microsoft extend the life of the branch, or are application vendors expected to keep the Microsoft schedule? Well, as a software vendor ourselves here at 1E, yeah, unfortunately, well, I can't speak for what Microsoft will do, and obviously large organizations hold a lot of weight with Microsoft. But yeah, what I would recommend is that you talk to your vendors today and see if they have support statements that specifically cover off how they're going to support the release of software. So if you, for example, you go to the 1E support on our website, we've got a statement where we'll have with each release we'll have a support statement out saying within 30 days of what's that we tested it with that version, and if there are any specific issues with that particular version, and then when updates will be available for fixing any of those issues. So the thing to do is really all software vendors are kind of having to face this. So we've all got to get onto that faster release, and yeah, it makes interesting QA for us as well. We've got a number of versions to test against each time as well. Probably time for one more. Let's have a quick scan some of these are kind of repeated here a bit on a sec. So there's one, yeah. What's the impact of updating Windows 10 faster than updating SCCM? At the moment, it seems like SCCM is released about a month before Windows 10, but I'm unsure of the impact of not updating SCCM. Yeah, what you'll see with Config Manager is that they kind of have a compatibility support for a version of Windows 10 and full support. And generally, I mean, because there's new features that get introduced into Windows 10, and then versions of Configuration Manager may take advantage of those features, then there's generally you'll have what's called compatibility support. So all of your sort of core functions, your inventory and all of the software distribution and that kind of stuff will work. You may have some issues with updates applying, feature upgrades to the next release if you haven't upgraded the config manager. So you may see some issues there, and maybe with OS deployment and things like that. If you think about some of the functionality with BIOS to UEFI that's happened, so there was the first changes that were made in config manager 16.10, and then there was more recently support for MBR to GPT in Windows 17.03. So to kind of use the full benefit of both of those, you need to have config manager 16.10 and Windows 10 17.03. So you're not going to lose core functionality, and so there's that compatibility mode, or compatibility support, but generally it's going to be things like where there's any integration between config manager features and the new feature in Windows 10, or maybe some of the OSD features and upgrading from from the current version up to the next version of Windows 10. So I think that's all we've got time for today on the questions. There's quite a few more in there, but we will, as usual, be writing those up and publishing them as a blog. So if we haven't got onto your question, then do look out for the Q&A blog over the next few days. So with that, just leaves me to thank you all for attending. The recording will be up on our website in the next couple of days, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks very much, Barry, for helping out with that as well.
My pleasure. Thank you, Dave.